Hello and welcome to Moments in History. I'm Linda Shenton-Matchett, author, speaker, and history geek. While researching stories, I unearth tons of intriguing historical information that does not end up in my books. So I've created this channel so I can share these tidbits with you. Today we're going to talk about Midwest farming in the mid-1800s. I'm the granddaughter and great-granddaughter of farmers, but I did not inherit any kind of a green thumb. I greatly admire the men and women who supply this country with food through their tireless efforts. In colonial America, agriculture was the primary livelihood for 90% of the population, and most towns were shipping points for the exports of agricultural products. Most farms were geared towards subsistence production for family use. The rapid growth of population and the expansion of the frontier opened up large numbers of new farms, and clearing the land was a major preoccupation of farmers. After 1800, cotton became the chief crop of southern plantations and the chief American export. Half a century later, industrialization and urbanization opened up lucrative domestic markets, but the number of farms increased exponentially because of the Homestead Act of 1862. Then again after the completion of the first transcontinental railroad. For those of you unfamiliar with this act, the federal government issued 160-acre tracts free to any family who lived on the land for 5 years and made improvements. The same amount could be obtained instantaneously for the paltry sum of $1.25 per acre. Nearly 500,000 people took advantage of this opportunity. Even more individuals purchased lands at very low interest rates from the new railroads, who were trying to create new markets. The railroads advertised heavily in Europe and brought over at very low fares hundreds of thousands of farmers from Germany, Scandinavia, and Britain. Laura Ingalls Wilder's Little House on the Prairie series, although fictionalized, provides a very good idea of life growing up in a farm in the Midwest in the second half of the 19th century. In the 1830s, about 250 to 300 labor hours were required to produce 100 bushels of wheat using a walking plow, brush harrow, hand broadcast of seed, sickle, and flail. During this decade, several inventions and patents began to make farm life a little easier. In 1834, the McCormick reaper was patented. The same year, John Lane began to manufacture plows faced with steel saw blades. 3 years later, John Deere and Leonard Andrus began manufacturing steel plows. 1837 saw practical threshing machines patented, and the 1840s brought about even more improvements and changes, such as the patent of the grain drill and mowing machine, the creation of the first grain elevator, the use of irrigation and mixed chemical fertilizers being sold commercially. By 1850, the number of hours required to produce that same 100 bushels of corn was reduced by nearly 2/3 and required half the number of acres, using a walking plow, a harrow, and hand planting. Inventions during this decade include a self-governing windmill and two-horse straddle row cultivator. The early 1860s witnessed a dramatic change from hand power to horses, which historians characterize as the first American agricultural revolution. The most important advance of the 1870s was the use of silos and the wide use of deep well drilling, two advances that enabled larger farmers and higher production of marketable surpluses. However, despite these technological advances that made farm life easier, there were economic difficulties associated with Western farm life. First and foremost was overproduction. Because the amount of land under cultivation increased dramatically and new farming techniques produced greater and greater yields, the food market became so flooded that prices fell sharply. While this might be good for consumers, the farmer had to grow a tremendous amount of food to recoup enough profits to survive the winter. New machinery and fertilizer was needed to farm on large scale, and often farmers borrowed money to purchase their equipment, leaving themselves in debt when the harvest came. The high tariff forced them to pay higher prices for household goods for their family, while the goods they themselves sold were unprotected. Then there were the railroads that often charged higher rates to ship the farmer's goods a short distance than a manufacturer would pay to transport wares at a great distance. In addition, the financial challenges nature created difficulties in many parts of the Great Plains. Blistering summers that included tornadoes, hail, drought, and floods, and blizzard-filled winters were commonplace. Insect blights raged through some regions, eating further into farmers' profits. In territories and states where it was too dry for wheat, the settlers turned to cattle ranching. So much of the Great Plains became open range, hosting cattle ranch operations on public lands without charge. In the spring and fall, ranchers held roundups where their cowboys branded new calves, treated animals, and then sorted the cattle for sale. Such ranching began in Texas and gradually moved northward. Cowboys drove Texas cattle north to railroad lines into the cities such as Dodge City, Kansas, and Ogallala, Nebraska. And from there, the cattle were shipped eastward. Here's a portion of an interview conducted by the Works Progress Administration in Spencer, who describes her pioneer rural childhood in the 1870s. All of our shoes were made by a man who came around every so often